afternoon. I'm going to get started now. It's 2 o'clock, and even though most of us aren't here seated yet. Sumud. If you have ever spent any amount of time in Palestine, you're familiar with this word. It's Arabic for steadfastness. In the context of the Palestinian quest for freedom, dignity, and equality, it means preserving your identity, your culture, and of course your physical presence on the land while living under the very unnatural state of military occupation. Staying on the land for people whose economy is primarily agriculturally based means everything. It means survival. But sumud is not an objective. It's an economic and a political strategy of resistance and perseverance. State building and economic development in Palestine in the absence of a political solution to the decades-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict can be thought of as a form of sumud. And for that reason, there is broad agreement in Palestine, in the international community, and even among those who support a two-state solution in Israel, that projects to promote jobs, investment, and institutions in Palestine are critically important. But of course, human beings, as a rule, don't just want to survive. They don't just want to live from day to day. We want to thrive. So how can Palestinians in this political reality where settlements are expanding deep into the occupied West Bank, so much so that the State Department issued a very, very rare condemnation last week to the Israeli government about this, how can they practice sumud without sumud becoming the objective itself? This conversation is all the more important now with the military occupation entering its 50th year. To talk about this today are analysts from Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit virtual think tank whose mission it is to educate and foster public debate on Palestinian human rights and self-determination within the framework of international law. Nearest to me is Noor Arafa, Jerusalem-based policy fellow with Shabaka. She previously worked as a researcher at the Ibrahim Abu Lughod Institute of International Studies at Bir Zayt University and at the Palestine Economic Policy and Research Institute known as MAS. She has a dual BA degree in political science and economics from Sciences Po University in France and Columbia University, and she holds a master's in developmental studies or development studies from the University of Cambridge. Noor will talk about the nature of the fragmentation of the Palestinian economy, particularly as it has resulted in the marginalization of the economy of East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. She'll also talk about the sectors of the Palestinian economy that still have some promise to fuel the limited development possibilities under occupation. Tariq Barkoni is Shabaka's DC-based policy fellow. Tariq is a visiting scholar at Columbia University's Middle East Institute. His forthcoming book, Hamas, The Politics of Resistance, is being published by Stanford University Press. Tariq holds a PhD in international relations from King's College London, which he completed alongside a career as an energy consultant. He also holds degrees from the University of Cambridge in international relations and Imperial College London in chemical engineering. His writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, Sada, a publication of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, The Guardian, The Huffington Post, The Daily Star, and many others. Tariq will discuss how the discovery of gas fields off Palestine's maritime borders affect the Palestinian economy. Nadia Hijab is the executive director of Shabaka, which she co-founded in 2009. She is a frequent public speaker and media commentator and a senior fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies. Her first book, Woman Power, The Arab Debate on Women at Work, was published by Cambridge University Press. She's also co-author of Citizens Apart, a portrait of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Nadia will discuss the role of think tanks, alternative media, and civil society organizations, the effect that they have on keeping democracy and human dignity alive. Noor.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Zaha, and the New America Foundation for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be here. In 1988, the renowned Palestinian economist Youssef Sayer argued that, and I'm quoting, "Meaningful and far-reaching development cannot be achieved under the conditions of dependence and dispossession." End of quote. So keeping this in mind, the purpose of the panel today is to explore the promise and pitfalls of development and economic peace in the absence of a political horizon in the occupied Palestinian territory. In my opinion, there's a need to revisit the current dominant development approach and think about forms of development that are in line with the Palestinian struggle for liberation. I will address this issue later in my presentation, but I will start with an overview of the Palestinian economy, and I will focus on the economy in East Jerusalem. So after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, the political, economic, and social structures of the Palestinian society were severely destroyed. Following the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967, the administrative and economic structures remained divided. And despite the existence of a single administrative structure after the creation of the Palestinian Authority in the wake of the Oslo Accords in 1994, fragmentation has only exacerbated. Today, I will discuss the economic fragmentation of the occupied Palestinian territory in light of Raja Khalidi's analysis of the existence of 5 enclave economies that coexist with the Israeli economy. So let's start with Gaza. The economy of Gaza has been in an increasing state of de-development, which is defined by Sarah Roy as a process that prevents development by depriving the economy of its capacity for structural transformation and by preventing the development of any self-correcting measures. De-development has been mainly the result of almost 10 years of an Israeli-imposed blockade on the Gaza Strip and 3 Israeli assaults in 2008, 2009, 2012, and 2014. Sea and land restrictions have isolated the economy of Gaza from the rest of the OPT and have heavily restricted Gaza's foreign and internal trade. Closures and movement restrictions have also paralyzed the agricultural, industrial, fishing, and construction sectors. As a result, Gaza's productive base and its private sector have been severely undermined. These policies, combined with the depleted power, education, health, and other services facilities, have rendered Gaza unlivable. As for the West Bank, there's what we can call a fragmented archipelago. In Ramallah, a neoliberal economic development model has been implemented, which includes institution building, increasing attempts to privatize services, reduce interest rates and inflation, and an increase in personal debt and growing inequality. And while a period of economic growth occurred during Salam Fayyad's government, this phase was ultimately unsustainable because the economy was mainly dependent on donor aid. Growth was also far from equitable because it was mainly taking place in areas A and B of the West Bank, whereas Area C was largely sidelined and off limits for Palestinian development because of Israeli restrictions on Palestinian access to their natural resources in Area C. In opposition to the economies of Ramallah and Area C, there's also the economy in Hebron and the southern West Bank, which have increasingly become the commercial and industrial center of the OPT. Meanwhile, new economic relations have developed between the economy in the northern West Bank, in the cities of Jenin, Nablus, and Tulkarem, and the Arab economy in Israel, in the Galilee and the Triangle. Palestinians in Israel are thus becoming a significant engine of the northern West Bank's economy. So what about the economy in East Jerusalem? Since the illegal occupation of East Jerusalem in 1967, Israel has been pursuing policies to isolate East Jerusalem from the rest of the OPT politically, geographically, socially, and economically through policies of annexation, isolation, and disintegration. Therefore, while East Jerusalem was the commercial, cultural, tourism, and transport center for Palestinians, it has gradually become separated from the economies of the OPT and increasingly dependent and integrated into the Israeli economy in a very distorted way. And so East Jerusalem has thus been in a development limbo, increasingly dependent on the Israeli economy for employment, trade, and finance, while socioeconomic conditions have only been deteriorating. For example, according to the Jerusalem Institute for Israel Studies, 82% of Palestinians in East Jerusalem were living below the poverty line in 2014. In comparison, the poverty rate in Israel as a whole was 22% during the same year. Unemployment rates are also very high at 19%, and they are especially high among fresh graduates and the most educated. East Jerusalem has also the lowest female labor force participation rate, which was 6.9% in 2014. It's one of the lowest rates in the Arab region. So the high poverty and unemployment rates are mainly the result of a weakening economic sector in East Jerusalem and the loss of productive capacity of the economy. In fact, East Jerusalem's economy is characterized by a weak Palestinian business and trade sector with stagnant commercial markets in the old city. Even the tourism sector, which could fuel the limited economic development possible under occupation, is in crisis, with a decline in the number of active hotels in East Jerusalem and also a decline in the number of tourists going to Palestinian hotels. Of course, the contraction of the tourism sector is a result of Israel's domination over the tourism sector and its restrictions on the development of the Palestinian tourism industry because of the isolation of East Jerusalem, the high taxes, the weak physical and economic infrastructure, the difficult licensing procedures for Palestinian tourist businesses, the obstacles on issuing permits to build hotels or to convert buildings into hotels, and the investment of millions of dollars for the development of the Israeli tourism market, leading to unequal competition between Palestinian and Israeli tourism industries. So as a result, the contribution of East Jerusalem's economy to Palestinian GDP has fallen from 15% in the 1980s to less than 7% in the recent periods. East Jerusalem residents also suffer from weak purchasing power and very high costs of living, especially for those who work in the Palestinian labor market. So a few points on the services sector in East Jerusalem. The education sector is very weak, with schools suffering from poor construction, deteriorating infrastructure, and overcrowding. The situation is exacerbated by the fact that that Palestinian schools are allocated lower budgets than Israeli schools. Israel has also been attempting to control the curriculum used by Palestinian schools in East Jerusalem. Recently, the Ministry of Education, headed by Naftali Bennett, has proposed a plan that will provide financial support to schools, but only those who accept to use the Israeli curriculum, which actually undermines the Palestinian political identity and attempts to Israelize the Palestinian educational system. And although Palestinians in East Jerusalem have some rights and receive services such as national insurance, health insurance, social assistance, and other services, they are subject to discriminatory measures that distinguish them from Israeli Jews who live in East or West Jerusalem. For example, Palestinians have very restricted access to land, with only 14% of land in East Jerusalem available for Palestinian construction. This, coupled with house demolitions and land confiscations for the construction of illegal Israeli settlements, has led to acute housing deficiency in East Jerusalem. Palestinians also face severe obstacles to get building permits. And while they pay the same amount of arnona or property tax as Israeli Jews, less than 10% of the Israeli municipal budget is allocated to Palestinian areas of Jerusalem, although Palestinians represent around 37% of the population in Jerusalem as a whole. And here I'm only talking about areas inside the wall. Planning and development in neighborhoods that are now beyond the wall is extremely poor, and governmental and municipal services are virtually absent, despite the fact that these Palestinians pay the same amount of property taxes as Israeli Jews and Palestinians inside the wall. So all these socioeconomic conditions should also be examined within the context of a huge Palestinian leadership, planning, and institutional vacuum in East Jerusalem and the absence of a representative body for Palestinians. So while Israel has a comprehensive vision for Jerusalem, a unified comprehensive vision and strategy for East Jerusalem remains absent. There have been some efforts to develop a plan for East Jerusalem by the Welfare Association, which focused on the Old City, by the Jerusalem unit at the President's office, and by some international donors such as the UNDP and the GIZ. However, despite these efforts, there is still a huge planning gap alongside the institutional and political vacuum. Since 2001, for example, Israel has closed more than 30 Palestinian institutions, including the Orient House and the Industrial Chamber of Commerce, in an attempt to tighten its control over Jerusalem and undermine political activism. Even the Jerusalem Governorate and the Ministry of Jerusalem Affairs operate from a building in Al-Ram, which is outside the Israeli-defined municipal boundaries of Jerusalem. There is also a big sense of political abandonment of East Jerusalem, which has led to institutional atomization, social integration, cultural and generational alienation, addiction, family violence, and other problems. So all this has led to the growing disenchantment of Palestinians with the Palestinian leadership, the Israeli occupation, and a sense of regional and international abandonment, especially at the official level. So against this background, the main question is, what development strategies can Palestinians undertake, especially in East Jerusalem, to ensure or to enhance Palestinian sumud, or steadfastness? So far, the prevailing approach to development by the Palestinian Authority and the international community has been apolitical. Development is usually disconnected from the historical and colonial realities lived by Palestinians, and the Israeli occupation is usually seen as an exogenous variable and a fact on the ground. So many development projects have so far been occupation circumventing projects without attempting to address the root cause of the problem, which is the occupation. However, it is vital to revisit this development approach and think of other forms of development that would help Palestinians attain their goals, which is freedom, justice, and dignity. So by rethinking development in relation to our liberation struggle, development becomes a political, economic, and social process of resistance against Israel's settler colonial regime, which is the root cause of the deteriorating socioeconomic and political conditions. Within this new framework for development, Palestinians need a proactive leadership that will propel the status of Jerusalem to the forefront of the government commitment and to the heart of the national struggle of Palestinians. It's also important to hold an internal debate and project a clear vision and an offensive strategy for Jerusalem to counter Israel's efforts to Judaize or ensure Jewish control over Jerusalem, and to decrease the dependency of East Jerusalem's economy on the Israeli economy. And I just want to emphasize that it's very important to ensure the participation of the local community and grassroots organizations, particularly the youth, in the development of this vision for East Jerusalem. So other steps that should be taken in the short run to enhance sumud. So first of all, it's very important to develop the tourism sector, which has been the backbone of East Jerusalem's economy. Some innovative ideas are currently being implemented by some Palestinian tourism experts, including the diversification of the Palestinian tourism product, the development of community-based tourism, community tours, and tourism cooperatives, and the promotion of East Jerusalem as a cultural destination rather than just a religious destination. It's also important, in my opinion, to promote domestic tourism by marketing East Jerusalem within a Palestinian package. For example, Hebron, Bethlehem, Jericho, Jerusalem, Nablus, and Nazareth. That would also be important to develop economic links between East Jerusalem and the economy of the rest of the OPT. East Jerusalem can also be marketed within a regional package, such as Amman, Jerash, Petra, Aqaba, Jericho, and Jerusalem. Islamic tourism campaign would also be important, and here the Palestinian Authority or the private sector could demand Asian Islamic countries to organize pilgrimage tours to Jerusalem in cooperation with Jordan and Palestinian tour operators in Israel. It's also important to support the commercial sector in East Jerusalem, especially in the Old City, which is experiencing economic collapse, and encourage the production of high-quality products. In the absence of the public sector, the private sector can play a significant role in supporting new opportunities to invest in small-scale industries in the Old City and Jerusalem in general. It would also be vital to provide financial and legal resources to help Palestinians in Jerusalem obtain the necessary permits to build legally in Jerusalem and promote public and private investment in housing projects, especially for the poor families. And one of the strategies that should be taken is to devise an employment plan, especially for the youth, given the very high unemployment rates, especially among fresh graduates and women in East Jerusalem. The goal would be to create decent jobs in East Jerusalem so as to decrease dependency on the Israeli labor market. And for all this to happen, it would be vital to create a funding body or a development bank to overcome the lack of funding, which is considered as one of the main problems faced by Palestinian institutions in East Jerusalem. So this development bank could provide credit facilities, especially soft loans, to Palestinians in Jerusalem. It could help finance the development of the housing sector, help merchants in the Old City pay the tax bill, and revive the commercial sector, and help it stand the intense competition from the Israeli market. And here, the Palestinian private sector could play an important role, as well as Palestinian banks, Palestinian diaspora, and the international community in general. And lastly, at the international level, recently, several American delegations have been coming to Palestine, and especially to East Jerusalem, to explore economic opportunities. So they met with businessmen, legal experts, economic experts, and youth, just to know about the situation, and everyone gave them an overview of the bleak realities faced by Palestinians in East Jerusalem. However, these delegations made proposals, for example, on the establishment of incubators, developing training programs for young people, helping the youth build soft skills and similar initiatives without any willingness to encourage investment, grants, or even loans, or to do something on the political front. So a focus on economic development is problematic when it is seen as a substitute for a progress on the political front. So one of the main arguments and messages of this panel is that we should focus on economic development as well as progress on the political front. And it's time for the US to translate its rhetoric into effective measures and hold Israel accountable for its illegal annexation and colonization of East Jerusalem, and help build a new international paradigm that is based on respect for human rights. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by thanking you, Zaha, and the New America Foundation for inviting us here and for hosting this panel. It's a particularly important discussion to be having at a time when there are rapid developments that are taking place in the region against the backdrop of political paralysis on the Israeli-Palestinian arena. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I want to talk about the issue of quote-unquote economic peace, which I would define as the pursuit of greater economic integration and normalization in the region. I want to do so from the lens of natural resources, which, to my mind at least, is the most effective and the clearest framework through which to understand the implications of economic peace, and to discuss the dangers as well as the benefits of pursuing this approach in the absence of a diplomatic horizon. We've projected a map here to help explain some of the things that I'll be talking about. Over the course of the past 2 decades, there have been substantial discoveries of gas reserves in Israel and the Palestinian territories. The manner in which these national treasures have shaped economic development within Israel and within the Palestinian territories elucidates very clearly the disparity which is inherent in the concept of economic peace. For Israel, the expansion of natural resources has provided much needed energy security and has almost overnight enabled the transformation from being an energy importer to becoming potentially a major energy exporter in the region. Palestinians have not been so lucky. They've, in fact, experienced deterioration in their energy sector. The current push to use these natural resources to advance economic integration might hold short-term benefits. But in the longer term, without a political framework, it merely propagates a fiction of normative sovereign relations between an occupying power and a captive economy in the West Bank and Gaza. To make this case, I'm going to provide a snapshot of the present geopolitical landscape before discussing both the advantages and the pitfalls of economic peace. So up until 2010 and 2011, Israel and Jordan were both reliant on gas imports from Egypt through a pipeline that crossed the Sinai Peninsula. And you can probably see that on the map. At the bottom of the map, Egypt would have transported a pipeline through the Sinai Peninsula that divided here and went into Jordan and into Israel, and into Jordan across the Sinai. Over the course of 2011 and 2012, as Egypt was rocked by the uprisings that overthrew the regime of President Hosni Mubarak, that pipeline in the Sinai Peninsula was attacked close to 18 times in the space of 2 years by Sinai-based militants. The flow of Egyptian gas across the Sinai into both Israel and Jordan was suspended, and both countries began seeking alternative sources of supply. Around the same time, in quick succession, an Israeli-American consortium of energy firms discovered 2 gas fields off the coast of Israel. The first, Tamar, which you can also see on the map here, was discovered in 2009. It's a gas field that contains close to 10 trillion cubic feet of gas. The consortium immediately began moving towards production, and gas began to flow into Israel in 2013. Tamar had sufficient resources to meet close to 30 years of Israel's domestic demand. It offered immediate relief from the insecurity of losing Egyptian gas. A year later, in 2010, the consortium discovered the much larger Leviathan gas field, which you can see to the left of Tamar. Production from Leviathan has not yet commenced, and it's estimated to hold almost double, so 20 trillion cubic feet of gas. With this discovery, Israel was placed in a position to set aside a considerable amount of its gas wealth for export. Within the space of 2 years, directly overlapping with the upheaval in the region, Israel had moved from being a regional gas importer to becoming potentially the most powerful gas exporter, or one of the most powerful gas exporters in the region. Following these discoveries, Israel has been on a quest to identify potential buyers of gas. Most recently, the Israeli Energy Minister Yuval Steinitz traveled throughout Europe seeking to drum up interest for buyers. And 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago now, Israel signed a deal with Jordan to supply the country with gas for close to 15 years. The US State Department has been intensely interested in these developments for understandable reasons. Greater energy integration between Israel and its neighbors can provide a substantial bedrock of stability by maximizing cooperation and codependence between American allies in the region, so namely Jordan and Israel. It could also open channels of trade and normalization between Israel and the Palestinians. It's possible to grasp the attractiveness of this approach. In the present case of the natural resources, there is obvious commercial advantages for Israeli gas to be used within the Palestinian territories as well as within Jordan. Israel now has an excess of gas reserves, and both those regions are still dependent on imports. In the case of the Palestinian territories, dependence on Israel already exists. The West Bank imports almost the entirety of its electricity from Israel. In Gaza, energy needs are met from Israeli and Egyptian electricity imports, as well as fuel purchases from the Israeli private sector, which is then trucked into Gaza. These imports are hardly sufficient and are hugely complicated, in Gaza at least, by the persistence of the blockade. Electricity in Gaza is only available for 6 to 8 hours a day, putting enormous pressure on hospitals, schools, sewage treatment plants, desalination plants, not to mention the everyday life of Palestinians. So gas trade between these locations and Israel can alleviate the financial benefits, can alleviate the financial burdens felt by the Palestinians, enhance overall quality of life, and underpin economic development. So far, a very rosy picture. This move towards energy integration appears to paint a positive landscape and makes a clear case for engagement. But such a depoliticized view can only go so far. It is in fact a deeply problematic approach to dealing with the reality between Israel and Palestinians, to say nothing of the detrimental consequences for neighboring countries. Why do I say this? Taken in isolation, the approach to economic peace and the picture I've just painted is a simple snapshot of the present reality, but it overlooks the broader historical context that got us here. Palestinians discovered their own natural gas more than a decade before Israel discovered Tamar or Leviathan. Off the coast of Gaza, as you'll see on the map behind me, Palestinians located the Gaza Marine gas field off the coast of Gaza in 1999. They sold the exploration license to BG, which was at the time their British oil and gas major before it was acquired by Shell. In the early days of the discovery, these national treasures were hailed as a breakthrough that could offer Palestinians a windfall. Lighting the first flare from Gaza Marine in 2000, the late Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat declared, and I quote, "This is a gift from our God to our people." It was thought that the discovery would essentially get sufficient revenue to build a Palestinian state and move Palestinians closer to their dream of self-determination. That move to sovereign rule was not to be. We now know very clearly the fate of the Oslo process over 20 years later. Limited Palestinian autonomy over truncated areas rather than real control over defined borders, an aid-dependent economy, which Noor just explained, and of course the erosion of territorial continuity with the ever-expanding settlement project in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Unlike Israel, which began the process of converting itself from a dependent energy importer into a powerful energy exporter 2 years after its gas discoveries, the Palestinians continue to lobby to develop their own resources 2 decades after they were discovered. A sign, if there was ever one, that no real Palestinian sovereignty has been achieved in the occupied territories. The Gaza marine field is not as big as Leviathan. Its total volume is about 1 trillion cubic feet of gas. So Palestinians would never have been able to move into becoming gas exporters. But exploration and production from Gaza marine would have met domestic energy demand, as well as provided a powerful form of revenue for a Palestinian government. This would have made Palestinians less dependent on aid and would have provided a powerful foundation for the emergence of a vibrant Palestinian economy. Instead of such an outcome, any form of Palestinian state building, of which there have been many, and Noor spoke of Fayyadism as well, has been crushed under the weight of occupation. It is the inability of Palestinians to explore their own natural resources because of Israeli restrictions that Palestinians remain entirely dependent on Israel for their energy needs. So in other words, rather than advancing their state-building efforts, Palestinians have been maintained as a captive market for Israeli resources. This ensures that Israel reaps the rewards of its own natural resources discoveries while retaining full control over the supply of energy to Palestinians. In this context, supply of Israeli gas to Palestinians carries a number of dangers, and I will highlight three. The first, it pins Palestinian energy security to Israel's goodwill. Israel can and has, in the past, used its power to effectively turn the taps off Palestinian consumers. I saw firsthand the destruction wrought on the only power generation company in the Palestinian territories, which is located in the Gaza Strip, after the war of 2014. The second danger. This approach legitimizes the Israeli occupation, which is now entering its 50th year. Not only is there no cost to Israel's prevention of Palestinian state building, there is rather a direct reward in the form of gas revenue for the sales of gas to territories maintained indefinitely under Israeli control. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, energy exchange and trade in the pursuit of economic peace between Israel and the Palestinians, in the absence of any political prospects, merely entrenches the power imbalance that has plagued interactions between the two parties, the occupier and the occupied, for decades. It concretizes Palestinian dependence on Israel, undermining any sovereign approach to decision-making. In this sense, while economic development could enhance Palestinian quality of life, such growth would only be tolerated within the overarching framework of the occupation, which would remain fully entrenched and unthreatened. One might think back to the similar quality of life initiatives that were put forward in the 1980s under the Reagan administration as a failed alternative to political engagement with the PLO. We of course know how Palestinians themselves reacted to such marginalization, with the outbreak of the Intifada in 1987 coming on the heels of roiling discontent on the ground. To sum up, with regards to the current energy landscape, without a political interlocutor that might be able to balance the power disparity between the players, this situation means that Palestinians are not only the weaker party, they have become locked in a reality where their livelihood is dependent on Israel's goodwill. In such a setup, the concept of negotiations is a fantasy. How can one effectively pressure the hand that literally feeds it? This might go some distance to explain the catastrophic situation of the PA and Hamas rule in the West Bank and Gaza, where dependency has now bred creeping authoritarianism. The idea of economic integration and development is important, and it must not be dismissed offhand. It must certainly be pursued for positive elements it does hold. It is indeed an anchor against stability and must be seen as one of the tools needed to address the needs of the inhabitants in the region. However, it must not be seen as an end in its own right, and certainly not as a substitute for a genuine political settlement for the Palestinians. The reason for this is that economic growth on its own will never remove the Palestinian call for sovereignty and rights or the demand for self-determination. That was a lesson that was fully articulated with the eruption of the First Intifada close to 30 years ago. So while economic peace could offer short-term relief, it will only pave the way for greater stability if it is built on a foundation of equality and justice. If not, it will only perpetuate the forces of instability that have prevented any peace from emerging. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaha. I just want to echo what Tariq and Noor said, and thank you very much for hosting this. I think no, it doesn't go further back. Okay, fine. I take my life in my hands, i.e. my laptop in my hands, because it's very risky to have it up here. So I hope all goes well. But my colleagues have covered the economic dimension, I think, anyway, in my mind, to my mind, very well. And I thank them. But the question I want to address is not only how to enable Palestinians to survive under occupation, which is the focus of many initiatives, but also in what shape they survive. First, a quick look at the state of play today in the occupied territories, where Israel's military occupation has by now effectively sealed off the three parts of the occupied Palestinian territories from each other and from the rest of the world, i.e. the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And it's caused further fragmentation within the West Bank. Noor has spoken about economic fragmentation, but there's also a social, cultural, and physical fragmentation. But this follows on, it's important to remember, this follows on the fragmentation of the Palestinian people and territory with the creation of Israel back in 1948 and the separation of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, what became the Palestinian citizens of Israel, from those in the West Bank and Gaza, and both those from the rest of the Palestinian people, from the refugees and the exiles. So this fragmentation of people and land actually facilitates Israel's colonization project in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which, as Tariq said, is now entering its 50th year. And actually has finally, things have got so bad that they finally pushed the Obama administration to last week, as Zaha mentioned, make the strongest statements against Israeli settlements that we've yet heard, saying that they cement the one-state reality of perpetual occupation. Of course, these strong words have yet to be accompanied by any form of meaningful action, and indeed are made possible by the very generous US military aid package it most recently signed with Israel. So there are now nearly 3 generations of Palestinians growing up and living under the daily humiliations of Israel's military occupation. This is a well-informed audience, and you may probably know the kind of daily humiliation Palestinians go through, but I'll just list a few. The harassment and dehumanization of the checkpoints, the arrests and jailing of anywhere from 1 to 30 Palestinians a day. And in fact, it's been estimated that about 750,000 Palestinians have been in Israeli jails since the occupation began. The loss of land and homes to the illegal settlements, which are suffocatingly encircling Palestinian towns and villages, the demolition of homes, the difficulty of securing permits to build, and of course the lack of freedom of movement and access within the occupied territories and between the occupied territories and the rest of the world. So in short, apart from small bubbles of Palestinian elites that are living in the territories, those living under military occupation live in a current state of insecurity and threat. This state of despair has found one expression in what is known as the Intifada of individuals, which broke out a year ago this October, and which has by now led to the killing of 220 Palestinians and 35 Israelis. Even the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, had to say earlier this year that the everyday reality of occupation provokes anger and despair, which are major drivers of violence. Worst of all is the growing loss of hope in the future of any positive change, and most of all in Gaza. So against this background is how can the Palestinians living under Israel's military occupation not only survive as human beings, but survive with a sense of human dignity, as a people who are entitled to human rights, even though these rights are denied them today. And this is where the work of civil society comes in, supported by the Palestinians themselves as well as by the international community. And this is where the investment made in culture and the arts is so essential and so much needed to support individual creativity as it is needed in defending the rights of Palestinians. This is where providing space, think tanks play a role in providing space for diverse and challenging analysis of the Palestinian predicament. And this is where alternative and social media organizations ensure that the Palestinians' voice is heard through the media. And the encouraging thing, I always try to find something encouraging in what is a really grim situation. The encouraging thing here, and I'm speaking obviously from a Palestinian perspective, is that many of these initiatives regenerate and rebuild the ties and the relationships between the fragmented segments of the Palestinian people, and reaffirming that there is such a people and that it's not confined to the small pockets of fragmentation in which it has been forced. I think, for example, of the work of the Qattan Foundation to support literature, art, music, theater, and dance with awards, support for shows and performances throughout Palestine and the West. It also fosters the use of art and theater in education and innovative approaches to science in education. And it's created a very creative center for the child in Gaza. Indeed, much of the work of the foundation focuses on youth. I mention this because, as I said, culture, investment in culture and the arts is so important. And obviously, this is not the only organization to do this. It's just an example. And in the absence of a functioning democracy, to put it mildly, in the occupied Palestinian territories, and worse, Palestinian Authority security coordination with Israel to keep the Palestinian population under control, it falls to human rights organizations, Palestinian human rights organizations, think tanks, and civil society organizations to keep the spirit of democracy alive and to hold the unelected officials accountable. For example, just to take one example, the rights organization Al-Haq not only does excellent work in documenting Israel's human rights violations and advocating for accountability from the US, the European Union, and the UN, but also demanding accountability from the PA itself for its rights violations. There are think tanks that study there are Palestinian think tanks that study Palestinian, Israeli, and regional developments. In the OPT, for example, the occupied Palestinian territories, I think of Masarat, which has been quite relentless in trying to promote an end to the division between Fatah and Hamas over many years. Based in the West Bank, it has also opened a branch in Gaza, and all its talks take place in both and are beamed from one to the other. It recently held a very informative and quite provocative series of presentations by Palestinian leaders from different factions as to what they would do to change the situation. There's also, if I may mention it, the think tank Shabaka, which I co-founded, and which is quite unique in pulling together Palestinian writers and thinkers from Palestine, from within Palestine, and from the diaspora to tackle political, economic, refugee, and civil society questions. The number of members in Shabaka, in the Shabaka network, has grown from 60 when it was first co-founded, when it was first launched in 2010, to 160 today. And it brings together, what's really great, it brings together established scholars and emerging new voices and new scholars, new voices of analysis. And it also now has pretty much a good gender balance of about 40 to 60. It had much less at the start. There are flyers outside where you can see some of our analysis. Do take one on your way out if you haven't taken one on your way in, and sign up the email list, the sheet for the email list if you want to receive more Palestinian analysis from a Palestinian perspective. Al-Shabaka's goal is to provide analysis and recommendations in order to help shape policy and also in order to contribute to a changing discourse. And again, a positive thing, the discourse on the conflict is changing, albeit slowly, with more attention being paid to the Palestinian narrative and question for rights, thanks to the work of alternative media and the advantages of social media. Here, I think it's worth citing the work of the Institute for Middle East Understanding, which was founded just over a decade ago to provide news, analysis, commentary, and speakers to the US media, and which has made a significant difference. There's also a strong example of alternative media in the Electronic Intifada, which was founded by Palestinians in the year 2000, and which by 2014 had attracted 6 million readers to its site. Much of the discourse is actually promoted by the efforts of Israel and its US supporters to stifle support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. The work to stop BDS through state legislatures and on campus actually draws attention to the core issues at the heart of the conflict. And because it's a First Amendment issue, it's debated actively, and you actually discuss how this conflict came about and debate how to bring it to an end. At this stage, I have to say, sadly, that the reality is there's no political solution that I can see personally on the horizon in the near term. Israel is too strong, and the Palestinians are too weak. But this doesn't mean, obviously, that we shouldn't work towards a solution, and then in one that can be lasting because it's grounded in rights and justice. At the same time, it's important to recognize that efforts for a quick fix are likely to make things worse for the Palestinians. For several weeks, there have been calls for the Obama administration to do something, anything, before he leaves office, either a presidential statement or support for a Security Council resolution that lays out parameters for a solution. A presidential statement won't change the situation one way or the other, but a Security Council resolution is much more serious. It could end up, in order to placate Israel, it could end up recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, thus officially condemning the Palestinian citizens of Israel to second-class status. It could speak of agreed modifications to the 1967 border before a peace agreement is agreed, undermining the principle of the inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by war, and it could undermine international law on the rights of Palestinian refugees. Even more dangerous is that the PLO and PA are so weak that they will welcome any international gesture, no matter how diluted, even though any improvements on the ground would be fleeting. I think these realities that I've set out here and that my colleagues Noor and Tariq have set out make it even more important to invest in the Palestinian economy, in the prospects for development under occupation, and in all the areas, if you like, the soft areas that I mentioned of culture and the arts, of think tanks and alternative media that are among the things that are so vital to keep a sense of human dignity alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadia, Tariq, and Noor for presenting what is a conundrum, I think, with Palestinian economic development. On the one hand, you want to be able to uplift the people, and at the same time, doing so might, in fact, seal their fate under occupation. And so thank you for painting that picture, which is leaves us thinking with more, having more questions to think about than answers, I think. One thing I wanted to ask before we take it to the audience for questions is about the youth. I think both you, Noor, and you, Nadia, mentioned how important the youth are. They are the majority of the population. I think 70% of the population in Gaza is between 15 and 29. So a very important segment of the Palestinian society. I wanted to share with you some polling numbers about the youth from the Jerusalem Media and Communication Center. They polled 1,000 Palestinian youths between the ages of 15 and 29 from the West Bank and Gaza between September 28th of this year and October 1st. And the poll found that 13.4% of Palestinian youth said that if there were elections, they would vote for Marwan Barghouti, who's a jailed Fatah leader, or 9.5% said they would vote for Ismail Haniyeh, deputy chairman of the Hamas, and 8.5% for Mohammed Dahlan, an exiled Fatah leader. Almost 2/3 say they do not want to see the PA dissolved. Surprisingly, only 10% of the respondents call the political situation their greatest problem. And I found that to be very odd. More than half, I think 54.5%, said unemployment is the biggest issue for them. And that shouldn't be surprising, given that many of the 35,000 students that graduate from colleges each year can't find a job in Palestine. Unemployment in Gaza is about 60% for the youth. What do you two make of this? If the political solution isn't forefront in their minds, and rather it's this economic piece, jobs and being able to survive and live, how does that translate to you in what you presented today?
Well, maybe I'll take a stab at that, and then maybe I'm sure Noor would have something to add. Obviously, there is no link, or the link in their minds has not been made between the political situation and the realities of the political situation, and why the economic situation is so very bad. And that's really interesting, and it's something that we should look out for in our work at the Shabaka, and how to, especially actually maybe the work that we're doing in the future in partnership with the American Friends Service Committee to work with youth, how to make that link so that there is better understanding of the need to be active while also seeking to earn a living, to be active on the political scene in a meaningful way. I think we definitely have to make that link. Noor, what would you say on that?
Well, I think I'm not really surprised that only 10.7%, you mentioned 10.7% said the main problem is the political situation, because at the end, I think when they talk about political situation, it's just the Israeli occupation, but unemployment, the lack of access to services are also all political issues. So it depends on how we define political situation. And I think 2/3 wouldn't want the PA to be dissolved, because the public sector provides, the PA provides employment to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank. So it makes total sense that they wouldn't want the PA to be dissolved. But I don't think we should explain or understand these statistics as if these Palestinian youth don't care about the political situation or the occupation, because at the end, all these socioeconomic problems and conditions are a product of the Israeli occupation.
I'll take some questions now from the floor.
Hi, thank you so much.
Sorry. I'm sorry. We're going to wait to get you a microphone since we're live streaming. I failed to mention that.
So thank you, New American Al Shabaka. My name is Suhad Baba, and I just wanted to ask on this question of economic dependence and fragmentation, if you can speak a little bit about some of the diplomatic developments over the last few decades that have created an arena and the conditions for Palestinian independence. I can't help but think about the fact that, from 1987 to 1989, when Palestinian society resigned from Israeli governmental institutions and from the labor market, and in the form of tax strikes and so on and so forth, that the Israeli GDP dropped by about 40%. But there have been real intentional political changes that have created an arena that we're living in today. And it would be helpful, I think, to talk through what those developments have looked like, because the current environment and the fragmentation that we're talking about has been a long-term process of over 30 years of re-entrenching the occupation and inequality.
Well, I think that's absolutely correct. I think that there's a history here that one overlooks when they think about the economic dependency of Palestinians on Israel. I think, to to my mind at least, there's a thread that can be traced back to the beginning of the occupation, whereby Palestinians were not so much a problem if they had no political goals. So if Palestinians were seen as a labor market, if they were seen as a source for buyers and consumers of Israeli goods, if they were seen as an element that contributes to Israel's economy, without seeking political rights on their own accords, then they could be then they could be tolerated. And that throughout the 70s and the 80s led to various initiatives from the Israeli government that were aimed at what is called limited autonomy or village leagues and quality of life initiatives, whereby Palestinians were given full rights and economic, social, and cultural freedom on a relative scale, as long as that didn't develop into political rights. And that situation was thought to be sustainable until 1987 ruptured the assumption that Palestinians would indefinitely accept that position that's given to them under what was effectively Israeli supremacy over their political rights. So I think structurally what we see now in terms of the dependence has changed quite significantly since '87 because of the fears of the various forms of resistance that came out of the Palestinian territories meant that Israel separated these territories, created other forms of labor, so African migrants into Israel now substitute for a lot of Arab labor. But I think underlying that, there is still a very strong structure that encourages, if not ensures, Palestinian dependence on Israel.
Dan Lieberman. Yeah, I'm not sure just how they determine, water rights, but from the map that was shown, it would seem to me that Lebanon had as much right to the oil fields as possibly Israel, and that all the oil fields are just an extension of the oil fields that are in Gaza. They're underwater, they just become one big oil fields. They may drip here and there. So I was wondering, are there any strong legal challenges to Israel's right to these oil fields?
Absolutely. Well, so I should highlight here, Tamar and Leviathan are actually unchallenged. They are definitely within Israel's maritime borders. So all the oil fields that are found in the Eastern Mediterranean, as they are in any other part of the world, they are demarcated on maritime borders between neighboring countries. In the case of the Eastern Mediterranean, the countries are Egypt, obviously Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, and Cyprus and Turkey. And there are EEZs, or special economic zones, that demarcate sovereignty for these different countries over these resources. So in the case of Gaza Marine, for example, it is unchallenged that it is a Palestinian gas resource. The Oslo Accords, however, have limited Palestinian abilities to get that far off the coast of Gaza to explore and produce from that gas field. Tamar and Leviathan are both Israeli, and that's unchallenged, and it's within international norms because they fall within Israel's maritime borders. But there are gas fields that are shared between Israel and Lebanon that are actually hugely contested. And both Israel and Lebanon put forward on an annual basis contestation or claims to sovereignty over those gas fields through international organizations that show how demarcation of sovereignty could work.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting talk. My name is Zane Preston. This question is for Ms. Arife. You mentioned funding the Gazan economy is suffering, and I was wondering about the funding stream from the Gulf. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I was wondering about the funding stream from the Gulf that was going into Gaza, as I recall recently. Is that still having an influence in the area, or is that effectively dried up?
So I don't know about the statistics with respect to funding from the Gulf to the Gaza Strip. Maybe Tariq can talk more about this. But if you look at it from a historical perspective, there's a surge in Gulf funding to the Gaza Strip which has also to do with Hamad Dahlan and his political relations with Qatar and the Emirates. So it's only increasing as far as I know, but I don't have the statistics.
Yes, I can add a few more points on that. So funding from the Gulf into Gaza has actually increased over the past few years because after the successive wars on Gaza in 2008, 2012, and 2014, most of the reconstruction that's been hoped to happen hasn't actually come through. So certain Gulf countries, specifically Qatar, have been very active in pouring money into Gaza for large-scale infrastructure projects, so highways, schools, hospitals. Those were seen very much as being part of a humanitarian relief and very much in terms of aiding the population of Gaza to survive what would otherwise be seen as a humanitarian catastrophe. Having said that, there's also a lot of funding that goes into Gaza for political reasons. So countries such as Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, as Noor mentioned in terms of support for Dahlan versus support for the Hamas government, there's constantly different forms of funding that go into Gaza to show support and to jostle for influence over Hamas and over the population there.
Hi, I'm Helena Cobbin. Pleased to be here. Sorry I was a little late. I was interested in the references to 30 years since 1987, since the outbreak of the first Intifada. I remember when I was there in earlier 1987 that Zev Schiff, who was still alive obviously, said, "I can't believe it's nearly 20 years of occupation. You know, this is something that we've never seen before in history. And here we are 30 years later, and we're coming up to 50 years of occupation, and it's like, what a big yawn. Like, you know, it's like not a big deal, like occupation is." So I guess my question, first of all, a little comment. Nadia, you were the one that mentioned this 30 years of the Intifada anniversary coming up. And you mentioned it also, and you kind of mentioned Ban Ki-moon's statement with apparent approval that there is some violence. But you didn't frame this in terms that occupation itself is violence. And that's, I think, an important reframing that needs to happen here. Because people say, oh, you know, there's violence in Jerusalem, there's violence in the occupied territories, when it's always violence is what Palestinians do. But the occupation itself is not maintained peacefully or gently. The occupation is violence, and I think that's an important point to make. So given that we have this eruption of what you've referred to as the Intifada of the individuals, it's kind of, it comes and it goes. It sputters along. It doesn't pose a challenge to anybody. It provides the Israelis the kind of the pretext for massive crackdowns. What do you see as the prospect for a real civilian mass organizing based Intifada as we approach, in particular, the 50th anniversary of the occupation?
Well, I can answer that very briefly and say none, because you cannot have a mass-based, and I don't know, my colleagues may disagree, but you cannot have a mass-based uprising if you can't even meet or connect or discuss, and the fragmentation that has happened now has been quite horrific, also in terms of dividing people. Like the Gazans look down on the West Bank, and the West Bank looks down on Gaza, and so on. But also political parties have been hollowed out. The political system has been hollowed out, and political parties played a vital role in 87. And they built, I think people, not you, but a lot of people would forget. They would say, oh, this sudden intifada. I mean, it took 10, 15 years of building and organizing and preparing and so on. We don't have, I don't see that we have that today. So I think what we're seeing now in largely Jerusalem, but also Hebron and so on, is, and I quoted Ban Ki-moon, not approvingly, but to say, to point to, you know, the fact that people are beginning to articulate the despair that is propelling the violence, because, you know, all we hear is that, oh, Palestinian violence, but what for, you know, what's causing it? And finally, somebody's saying it's the despair that's causing it. And I think we're at a time when maybe some of the locus of the Palestinian sumud, I mean, not sumud, some of the, I don't like to call to use the word resistance, because it's been also co-opted as a word to mean military resistance. But I think maybe the locus of some of the Palestinian civil resistance has shifted to the outside, where you have more freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom to organize, obviously in connection with the Palestinians inside. And for a while, and I'm sorry I'm going on a bit here, but for a while I think the locus of resistance, nonviolent resistance, had shifted to the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I think Israel quickly spotted that and tried to clamp down on that. I don't know if anyone wants to add.
I mean, I completely agree with this analysis. And for me, at least, the first time I went into Jerusalem, I was struck by the fact that East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem aren't separated physically. So, you know, East Jerusalem, how easy would it be for people living in East Jerusalem to march onto West Jerusalem and stop all forms of everyday normal life in West Jerusalem? You would think that's a relatively straightforward act of civil disobedience. But I think that there has been an internalization of years of repression. There has been an increased sense of fragmentation and an increased sense of desperation. And I think any form of organization has been tainted with such a degree of cynicism that it's just no longer forthcoming. So in my mind, at least, the two most inspiring areas to look at in terms of Palestinian civil resistance, to use Nadia's terms, are the Palestinian citizens of Israel and internationally. And I think that from that platform, there could be a greater impetus for organization and mobilization within East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank.
I just want to, say yes, I agree with everything that you've said too, but I wonder, because I'm starting to see more creative ways of organizing and of coming together, like, you know, through the use of social media, but also direct nonviolent action in localized areas. So you're not seeing the traditional sort of mass marches and those kinds of things, but you're seeing people through social media getting together in localized areas to challenge certain aspects of the occupation. And you see that in places like Berlin and in the setting up the occupation by Palestinians of territories that have been taken over by the Israelis, by setting up tents and waiting for the Israelis to take them down. So it's those kinds of smaller actions that are taking place, but I think the Palestinian youth have been really good at creating spaces where space doesn't exist for them to engage in protest. And so I think we'll continue to see more ways in which they kind of get around the fragmentation of the Palestinian people and from their own land. And yeah, Dan.
Great, thanks so much for all of your excellent comments. My question is about checkpoints and the movement of goods. You know, how important is it to invest in getting goods crossing those borders within the West Bank more freely, and how much is this kind of an issue of normalization? And I'll just give you a quick example. I worked for many years at the USAID office, the Palestinian office, and we made two decisions. For the northern West Bank in Jenin and Nablus, we invested heavily in the checkpoints to get scanners so that trucks could move back and forth more freely, and that resulted in a lot of movement of goods. And you could argue that that helped the economy in the northern West Bank. In 2013, when I was there was a proposal to help with the Calandia checkpoint. And the decision was made not to touch that politically, not only because it's contentious, but also just because of the issues of normalization. You don't want to invest in a checkpoint. And all of these checkpoints in the West Bank are pretty far inside the Green Line in Area C. So I guess my question is, did we get one of those decisions right, and did we get one of them wrong?
Yeah. So just a couple of comments on the US aid. I think what is problematic, I can understand the importance of investing in scanners to ease the movement of goods between different Palestinian cities within the West Bank. But the problem is that you're accepting the occupation as given, you have the checkpoints, and you're just trying to circumvent these movement restrictions instead of addressing the root cause of the problem. And that in itself is problematic. The other point is that this approach is also enforcing the physical and economic fragmentation of the West Bank. So you still have the checkpoint. It's still very hard to move goods from Nablus to Jerusalem, for example. And so all this prevents the economic integration and having one economic unity within the occupied Palestinian territory. One other point I just wanted to make on the US aid in general is that the US aid, I don't know if the audience knows, the US aid does not have any development projects in Jerusalem. And compared to the other, it's not because we want them to have projects, but they do not have projects. And only, I think what the the development aid that Palestinians receive from the Americans through US aid is 10% of the development of the aid that Israel receives from the Americans. And out of this 10%, most of it goes to pay the salaries of American employees who work in Tel Aviv to administer and supervise these projects. So that's another point, but maybe we can discuss this later.
You guys have anything to add?
I mean, I guess I would add, I would go back to Zaha's earlier comment that it's a conundrum. How do you increase economic development and economic growth within the structure of occupation? And I think I completely agree with Noor when she says you're accepting the reality as is and working within it instead of changing it. At the same time, I think there's a balance to be struck. If there needs to be the facilitation of movement, for example, in my mind, I'm thinking of Gaza and facilitating entry of goods into Gaza. If that's needed for humanitarian relief, then it shouldn't be stopped because the structure of occupation, until we wait for that structure to be removed, because that could be a very long time in the making. So I think there's always a balance to be struck, and I think that that balance shift towards fortifying the occupation when it becomes permanent rather than temporary, and when there's no political pressure that is accompanying that facilitation of movement to remove the checkpoints.
Thank you very much. This question, I guess, is primarily for Tarek regarding the gas resources. I'm wondering, you talked about Israel trying to sell to Europe, and I'm wondering how successful they were, or where they found markets. And related to that, what is the projection economic benefit of these gas fields? You may have mentioned it in terms of, I don't know, GDP or however you want to express it. And also related to that, could you comment on the protests in Jordan against the gas deal and what that means, both in terms of the Palestine context, but also the broader region?
Yes, 3 excellent questions. So Israel is trying to sell to Europe. Europe has its own issues with energy security, mostly related to the fact that they get most of their energy from Russia through pipeline. And there's always a fear that Russia can turn off the taps on European consumers. So they look for alternative ways to get gas supply. One of those is through LNG, so liquid natural gas, through the global markets. A pipeline is always cheaper than LNG, and so Israel is a very possible supplier of gas. There are a number of issues that arise, including the fact that Cyprus and Turkey now both have gas fields, and both could act as energy hubs into Europe. So Israel is competing with other sources of supply. Before Israel begins moving towards production from Leviathan, in order to get the oil and gas companies to invest in developing the field, they need to secure certain buyers. They haven't secured any from Europe yet. I think they're still very actively trying to secure those buyers, so it's just we need to wait and see. But there are complications that are arising. I'll take your third point about Jordan first, just as a follow-on on that. The gas deal between Israel and Jordan advanced Israel's ability to attract these investors, because now it has one buyer for 15 years committed to buying a certain portion of Israeli gas. So in that sense,